Welcome to Science Fiction 101, the podcast series where we explore the science fiction field from all angles, covering the past, the present, and the future. We're your hosts. I'm Phil.
And I'm Colin.
And today we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to review a film that was never made. I mentioned last time that I had rewatched Close Encounters of the Third Kind on Blu-ray. Around the same time, I also found the original screenplay by Paul Schrader, which Steven Spielberg rejected. So there's a version of the film that exists on paper, but was never actually made. Also coming up later in the show is a little quiz. Before we talk about the script, Colin, what do you recall of the actual film, Close Encounters of the Third Kind? When did you last see it?
I last saw it about a month ago. My son, who was home for the summer from school, said that he had never seen it. So I went to our local library, which is very well stocked, and got, I think, one of the anniversary Blu-rays and watched, I want to say, the director's cut. Because I think there are actually three versions of the movie. There's the original, yes. There's the expanded one that Columbia wanted Spielberg to release, and then later on there was, in my head I call it the director's cut, but it's the one that he prefers that has some of the new stuff and some of the old stuff still removed from it.
Yes. If you had to sort of summarize Close Encounters of the Third Kind, kind of do a brief plot summary, how would you describe it?
Oh my. I think it's hard to summarize in something short because there are actually three main plot lines running through the movie.
Right.
The one I think everyone knows off the top of their head is Roy Neary's.
Yes.
So he is a linesman who has a close encounter with UFOs, and it fundamentally changes him. He becomes obsessed with trying to understand what has happened to him and what these things are, and it eventually ends up destroying his family and sends him on an adventure that is galactic in scope.
So that's one thread. What are the other threads then?
It turns out Roy, his encounter is not unique. There's another encounter with a mother and her son, and the son is kidnapped. And now this mother must go try to find what happened to her son.
And then the third thread is the scientists, I guess.
Yeah. I think of them as like almost like the United Nations.
Yeah.
Where they begin to investigate these odd happenings all over the world. An ocean liner shows up in the desert. Airplanes that were lost in the 1940s show up with no pilots in the middle of nowhere. And then they have to deal with this odd gathering of people from all over the world who are all trying to get to one place in the United States all at the same time, despite their best efforts to stop them.
And that one place is Devil's Tower, which is in Wyoming, I think?
I think you're right. Do you remember how they got the coordinates for where to go?
No. All I remember is that they went and got a globe and followed the latitude and longitude to figure out where those points were, but I don't remember where they got the information from.
They took the notes, the musical sequence, and beamed them out, and then they received a bunch of repeating integers as a pattern back.
Ah, yes.
And those integers were GPS coordinates, latitude and longitude.
Yes, and that's really nicely done. Anybody else making the film would have somebody simply looking, well, nowadays they'd go on Google Maps, but in those days they would have gone to an atlas or a fold-out map. But Spielberg is special, so he has somebody remember that there's a globe in a room down the end of the corridor, so they go and get it, and they roll it all the way along the corridor. It's totally unnecessary, but it's very dramatic and visual and fun.
Well, it would have been right there. You could have looked at it there instead of rolling it down the hallway. But yeah you're right. It's a great moment, talking about the excitement and there's some action going on.
Yeah. So everything sort of all comes to a focus at the end of the movie. And I think that's one of the great things about Close Encounters is that you've got these three storylines which turn out to all be about the same thing, and they all converge. And they converge not just in story terms, but they converge at a single place and a single time. And I think that's terrific. I think that's really good film storytelling.
Oh, yeah.
And when you watched it recently, did you think the visual effects held up? Because I did. I thought it looked terrific.
Yeah, maybe the only part that doesn't hold up really, really well are the aliens at the end because they were stop motion.
Yeah, actually there's a mixture, isn't there? There are some that are either little people or children dressed up as aliens. There's at least one which is a marionette. It's a string puppet. So it's a very weird mixture.
Earlier in my history, I spent a lot of time with music teachers, and the hand gestures for notes, they're called solfege. So when the alien's up there doing solfege to the Close Encounters of the Third Kind theme, I think that was stop motion.
I like the fact that the communication between Earthlings and aliens is partly through music, partly through flashing lights or coloured lights, and partly through these hand gestures. And those are really very underplayed. You see the main scientist doing the hand gestures at a couple of points in the film. And then when we get the closest encounter with the alien creatures, we see the alien making those gestures back. There's a recognition that communication can be along more than one dimension.
Yeah, they don't sweep it under the rug with saying the aliens have been studying us forever and know English, or that we have a universal translator, or...
Yeah. So that's Close Encounters, the film, as most of us know it. But that film ultimately derives from a young Steven Spielberg's belief that flying saucers were real. Apparently he doesn't believe in them anymore, but he did at the time. And what he wanted to make was a film which combined his fascination for UFOs with something that was really quite popular, or unpopular, I suppose, at the time, which was the Watergate scandal. In other words, cover-ups. And he wanted to combine the two. That's not how it turned out, but that's what he wanted to do. And this is where Paul Schrader comes in. Paul Schrader was, at the time when this was written, he was really just a film critic and a beginning screenwriter. And he'd written one film at that time, which was The Accuser. Shortly afterwards, he would go on to write Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, American Gigolo, The Last Temptation of Christ, and many, many more. And he also became a director. But this was really quite early in his film career, as it was for Spielberg. At the time that they started on what became Close Encounters, Spielberg was just really a beginning filmmaker. He'd made a couple of movies, but nothing that had really made a big impression. That would come very shortly afterwards, in 1975, I'm going to say, with Jaws. And of course, once he'd made Jaws, he could make anything, because that was the biggest blockbuster up till that point. But in 1974, he was not a big name, and Paul Schrader was not a big name, but they teamed up, and Schrader made the first attempt to write the film that Spielberg wanted. So this is what we're really reviewing today, this Paul Schrader screenplay. It's freely available on the internet, so we'll give you the link in the show notes. But in our discussion of it, I'm pretty sure we can talk about it in a way that makes sense, even if you haven't read it.
Oh, yeah.
So we're going to kind of review the film that never was. Now, the plot of this script. Would you like to have a go at summarising that, Colin?
You know, in the way that I described the movie, I think this script is very similar in some ways, because it's a story about obsession.
Okay, yes.
It's the story about a government employee that has a close encounter with a UFO that fundamentally causes him to become obsessed and change his life.
So it is the Roy Neary thread from Close Encounters as we know it, but with a very different character.
Oh, yes. This character starts off being part of the government, and he is in charge of debunking UFO stories.
Yes.
And after he has an actual UFO encounter, he becomes part of another governmental group, which is trying to contact and understand and yet still cover up actual UFO stories.
And there's a nice little scene where he meets somebody from that other department, and this other person says, I'm from the government department that investigates UFOs. And he says, well, you can't be, because I'm from that department, and I don't know who you are. And that other man has to explain, no, you're from the department that covers up the UFOs. We're from the department that really investigates them to find out what's really going on. Mm-hmm. What else goes on in this film? We get a lot of investigation. Yeah,
including the point where the population of a town has all assembled to hear someone talk about UFOs. One of Paul's, and Paul's our main character, one of Paul's compatriots is releasing weather balloons to try and debunk what they are all gathered to talk and discuss about.
Yes, yes. So there is not just a wish to downplay the UFOs. There is a deliberate, concerted effort to mislead the public. Now, there's a bit of that in the film as we know it, but I think in the film it's presenting so many different viewpoints that you don't feel that the film is about a cover-up. There are characters whose job it is to cover up, but the film isn't about the cover-up.
I would agree. I think it's also a UFO tutorial. There is so much discussion about, what UFOs were thought to be. Is it a plasma? Is it a weather balloon? Is it a satellite launch? Is it this? Is it that? A lot of that doesn't make it to Close Encounters, the movie. And I was wondering if that's because there's, an understanding that at this point, there's enough UFO knowledge in the popular culture that you can skip that.
Most of what we know in Close Encounters, we know because we see it happening in front of us. Mm-hmm. But the film doesn't stop to say, what you've just seen is. Close Encounters just gives you things that you witness, and it lets you piece them together and be curious and be driven.
How did you feel about the pacing of the script versus the movie?
Oh, terrible. Did you feel that as well?
It seemed very, very slow. It felt like it took forever to get to where Paul was set up to move on.
Yeah, I thought it was really slow. And, well, actually, there were some bits that then went a little bit fast, but the pacing was all over the place. But there was also a problem for me that it kept going backwards in time. So we start off, I think, in present day, which is in the script is identified as being 1975, but then it goes back to 1960, and then at some point it comes back to the present day, and then it goes back again to the past, but not to 1960. It sort of jumps a few years forward. Every time there was a shift of time, I found myself wondering, does that really matter? Did you have to specify this was 68? Could we not just assume we're still back in 1960? And it would have been far better if it had tied more to real events. There was some mention of Nixon becoming president.
But yeah, it makes you wonder, why does the screenplay need to literally evolve over decades?
Yes, yes.
Whereas I have the feeling that the movie, it happened in a week.
I don't know much about this particular draft of the film. As far as I know, Schrader only wrote the one draft and was then dismissed from the project. Spielberg, in interviews, has repeatedly said that the script was no good and that he couldn't use it. But having said that, I think some parts of the script are well written, and to me it just reads very much like a first draft. This is typical of what a writer produces when they do a first draft. Then you do the second draft, and that's where you fix all of the problems. But this one, it seemed to be inventing some new ideas, and some of them were never followed up.
Yeah. The implanting of all the sensors and the eye drops, and what is he getting prepared for? I don't think we ever finally learned or why that was significant.
No, that's really rather weird, isn't it? And maybe we should talk about the ending, which that ties into. But before we do that, there's a couple of key scenes that I'd like to discuss because they do have some resemblance to what we see in the finished film. Our main character, who, as you say, has this kind of reversal when he goes from being the UFO denier to being the UFO advocate. Mm-hmm. His encounter is when he's driving. In that sense, it is similar to the Roy Neary character's encounter in the finished film, because that happens when he's out on a job. It's night time, and all of a sudden he sees coloured lights, but he's too busy dealing with something. I think he's looking at a map or something, and he doesn't really see what's going on around him.
Yeah.
So Neary's encounter is similar to Paul's encounter in this version of the script, although I think the film version is much, much better. But what did you think of that as the sort of the turning point for the character?
It took so long to get there. I was kind of waiting for something or anything to happen. It was good. And that turning point in the story now begins a long slide in Paul's life. He loses his family. He's going to lose his job. Yes. I can't remember how I felt as I was reading it originally. I can only look at it back through that lens of everything that happened after that.
In a way, that's similar to what happens to Roy Neary in the finished film, because his obsession drives a wedge between him and his family. But I think in the film, that character is so likeable that you're willing to stay with him, whereas the character Paul in this script, I don't find him very appealing.
So I have 45 years of time with Roy Neary.
Yes.
And I've only very recently met Paul. So it's hard to make, I think, a true apples to apples comparison, because if you look at Roy's experience in an absolute sense, he turns into a raving nut job. So why do I know that what Roy is going through is okay? And I think it's because I know in the end that Roy is right. And that, his wife and children are kind of the victims of not supporting him in a way.
Yes.
Not knowing what he went through. Whereas Paul's job was to lie and intimidate people. And as a character, he's drawn in a kind of a classic 50s, 60s way, very detached, very professional, not engaged to his family very closely.
And I think part of it is because he's a man in uniform, isn't he? I mean, there's even a scene fairly early on in the script where I think he's sort of partly casually dressed, but the minute he steps outside of the building, he puts on the final parts of his uniform. I think it's his jacket and his hat. So he's not really an individual human being. He's the representative of the system.
Yeah, I could definitely see that.
Other things that are in the script that are slightly similar to the film, there's the evacuation of a town because the authorities want to investigate and cover up. So they say that something has happened. I can't remember what it is.
I think it's a nerve gas accident.
Yeah, that's it, yes. So they tell all the people in the town, there's nerve gas, so you've got to go. That's similar to what we see in the finished film. As Roy Neary approaches Devil's Tower, there are roadblocks, there are what appear to be dead cattle on the side of the road. So it's slightly similar. Something else in the script which reminded me a little bit of what's in the film, even though it is very different, is Paul and his colleagues have almost an obsession with building a replica of the flying saucer. They build a model and they try and get it as accurate as they can. They then tow it behind a jet aircraft, trying to attract the aliens. Is that right? Is that did I read that correctly?
Yeah, isn't that part of the big multi-panel jumbotron where they're showing the history of human evolution on Earth as well, and they're trying to use the spaceship to get their attention to say, hey, look at this and communicate with us?
Yes, that's right. So that reminded me of the finale of the finished film, where we do have the actual encounter with the flying saucer. But in almost every case where there is a point of comparison between this script and the film, I found myself thinking, that was so much better in the film.
Yeah, that's one thing about the movie where I feel like the plot does drag down a little. As Roy goes into his obsession and as the mother, as she begins to search for her son, I think the plot does tend to drag there a little, but you have to go through that so that then you can pick it up at the end as everyone that's had a UFO encounter begins to have visions and dreams and sculptures about Devil's Tower.
There's a similar kind of thing in the Schrader script where somehow knowledge of the aliens is implanted in people's minds, but he doesn't do it in a way that visually makes sense. Whereas what Spielberg does is he shows people being obsessive with their paintings and their sculptures, and then there's a beautiful reveal scene where Roy Neary has built this colossal model of a mountain, and he's no idea what it is or why he's doing it. He's just driven to build it. And as he's doing it, on the TV in the corner of the room, there's a news report about Devil's Tower. But he doesn't see it because he's looking the other way. And then eventually at the end of the scene, he sees that footage, and he looks from the footage to the mountain that he's built. And we know at that point he knows what he has to do next. And that is such beautiful storytelling. It's completely over the top, and it must have cost a fortune to build that mountain for him in his living room. But what a very effective way of getting the information across to the viewer without stopping to explain.
Well, and then there's a huge payoff for his sculpture. So there's a group of people from literally all over the world that are trying to get to Devil's Tower. And as these people encounter the various literally roadblocks that the government has put up, they keep getting winnowed down into a smaller and smaller party.
Yes.
And at one point, they're trying to scramble up the side of Devil's Tower because they're being pursued by the government. And there's a discussion about which way to go. You can head off to the left, you can head off to the right. Roy is pretty unique in that he did sculpture, so he literally knows every inch of the landscape because he's recreated it. And he's like, no, you have to go this way because the way you want to go leads to a box canyon that's a dead end.
Yes. And he says to the woman something like, you don't know that because you only did paintings.
Yeah, and I can't remember anything that has that huge payoff from the screenplay. It's just not, those kinds of things aren't there.
The ending of the screenplay doesn't include any actual flying saucers. Although we are shown some flying saucers in earlier scenes in the movie, the conclusion that our main character comes to, and therefore that the script comes to, is that the aliens are somehow communicating with our minds directly or implanting information in our minds. And in order for us to go to the stars with the aliens, we don't need to physically board a spaceship. We need to somehow be mentally taken there. I think that's how it goes.
I'm looking through the screenplay right now, and there's a motif which comes back in the script several times. There's what they call the space sound and what they call the saucer sound.
Yes.
And toward the end of the script, he's up on a rocky knoll, and there's a big red semicircle, which kind of looks like the sun, but is, I think, a UFO. But you're right. He doesn't actually enter it. He's given this racial memory where he experiences the dawn of the universe. It reminded me a lot of the child sequence in 2001 at the end of that movie.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely it does, yeah. The downside of the success of 2001 is that when anybody tries to represent alien encounters, all they can do is replicate what happened in 2001. Because you've got it here. He's sort of taken on a journey across the stars and back through time in a way that you can understand while you're reading the script, but as a filmmaker you would look at it and say, how on earth do I show this? So you've got it here. You've also got it at the end of Star Trek the Motion Picture, where the writers of the script had kind of painted themselves into a corner and not known how to finish the movie. So all they could do was say, well, we'll take these two characters and we'll say they're being taken away by V'Ger, and off they go in a flash of light.
Yes, to be one with the creator.
Yeah, it's kind of, we don't know how to end this in the case of that film and in the case of this screenplay. And if I were Spielberg, regardless of any other strengths or weaknesses this script has, I think it would be that final scene that would cause me to say no to this script. You've got these people investigating flying saucers, and then at the end of the film to say, well, yes, flying saucers are real, but actually, no, it's all in the mind.
I think that's something the movie did very, very well.
Yeah.
There's the payoff from the things that happened in the beginning. So we find this abandoned ship in the desert. We find these abandoned planes. Well, at the end of the movie, all these people that have disappeared in odd disappearances all over the world and across decades, they all come out of the spaceship. And we're being told who these people are one by one, right? This is this lieutenant commander from this airplane flight which disappeared in 1960, and here's these other people. And there's almost an exchange going on where they're getting rid of their old humans and getting a new batch. And then the other part of the plot that we haven't talked about a lot, which is Lacombe, the scientist UN representative.
Yeah.
His obsession or his faith is that the aliens did things for a reason. They picked these people.
Yep.
And so we should be choosing them instead of our astronauts and governmental representatives and military representatives.
Yes. And that's how it is that Neary gets to go on the trip, isn't it? It's because of Lacombe's intervention. But I think what we're getting to now is thematically what Close Encounters is really about, and to an extent what Paul Schrader's abandoned script is also about, and that is that neither of these are really about flying saucers. They're really about religion. They're about having a faith or not having a faith. And I think what works really well in the film is that Lacombe and all the other scientists, they're all pursuing this goal of communicating with the aliens. Mm-hmm. But so are the obsessed people. I mean, Lacombe is obsessed in a way, but he's professionally obsessed. He may be personally driven, but he's professionally obsessed with understanding what all this is about. Neri and all the others who, as you say, are chosen, they are kind of religiously, fanatically obsessed. It's interesting that you said that the aliens have chosen certain individuals, and I don't know if they have. I think it might be random, but I think having been granted a visitation by the aliens, I think everybody in that position then becomes obsessed. So I don't know if they're being chosen by the aliens because, oh, you'll be a good one for us to have.
Oh, yeah. I see your point.
You see
yeah. They weren't pre-selected and sifted. They were like, well, we're going to go here, and then whoever happens to see us,
yes,
we'll give them this vision in their mind of a place they need to go to.
Yes. I mean, they're still being selected in that sense, but they're not being targeted. And what's quite beautiful in the film is that very moment with Lacombe where he recognises that these people have as much right to meet the aliens as he does. And there's almost a sense of regret. I don't know if he explicitly says this, but there's something in his dialogue which implies that he wishes he had the same kind of experience that they had had and had the same kind of faith that they have, but that he's been brought here because of the science.
Mm-hmm. I think you could make 2 small changes to the movie and it would completely destroy that.
Yeah.
And that is, we get to go through Neri's and the mother's encounters with the UFOs with them. We go on that journey with them and we observe it.
Yes.
If you take out that 6 minutes of the movie, there's a much bigger leap of faith for the audience to then say, well, are these people nuts?
Yes.
or is what they believe and what they say they saw and went through true? Like, maybe the little boy was kidnapped, or maybe something nefarious happened to him, and maybe Neri's just a bored linesman who was drunk or high or something else and had a... But by going through those things with them in real time, as the audience, we're immediately brought in with them.
Yeah. And if there is one good thing in Paul Schrader's script, maybe that's where that notion comes from, because he very definitely shows Paul's encounter as being something that is real and transformative. I think there's a difference, though, and that is that Spielberg shows us more than one experience. It's not just Neri's experience. There are other people. And when people get together and are able to compare notes, it becomes very convincing to them. Whereas in the Schrader script, our man, Paul, witnesses this thing, but he's totally on his own. Nobody else has really witnessed it that we know of, because all the others have been debunked.
The way in my mind I've drawn it is that Paul and Higbee are part of Project Blue Book. They're the the face investigators.
Yes.
But the real government group in the background, those are the men in black.
Yes. Oh, I had that exact thought. Yes.
Those unexplained men that happen to show up in dark cars and black suits. They have no identity. They have no names.
Yes.
In the late 1970s, after Close Encounters came out, there was a television series that I watched called Project Blue Book.
Yeah.
Or Project UFO.
Yes.
And I was having all these weirds like, wait a minute, I've seen or watched something like this. What was it? And I thought I was like, that's what this is. And so I went to Wikipedia. Yeah. It's like, yes, it's all here. And it makes me wonder if, Schrader's script inspired someone, or if it was a parallel development, or who knows what.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember that series, and it used to drive me mad because, I mean, I'm a skeptic with regard to all of these things, but I was fascinated by the subject. I was fascinated that people reported seeing them, but I didn't believe for a minute that they had really seen what they said they'd seen. I always thought it was about misinterpretation and all of that. Mm-hmm. And what drove me mad, even as a kid, with Project UFO, is that they would show somebody clearly witnessing a flying saucer. And then at the end of the show would come up that disclaimer at the end, which basically said, the Air Force has rigorously investigated all of these claims. Not one of them has ever been found to be worthy of our time. And that used to annoy me intensely, because to my mind, either the show should be believing it and presenting everything in a credulous way, or the show should be totally sceptical. And every one of those encounters should have been completely blown away by the investigators. But it always wanted to have its cake and eat it.
Yeah, and at the end of many of the episodes, didn't they actually show, like, some other event which corroborated what had happened? And then there would be this disclaimer at the end.
Yes.
Where it's kind of perpetuating that this is really happening, but the government is telling you something different.
Yeah, yeah. I loved and hated that show. There's a couple of final things I've got in my notes that I wanted to shoehorn into the discussion, so I'm going to put them in here and see what your response is.
Okay.
According to Schrader, he wanted to make this script, which, by the way, was called Kingdom Come. When he finished the draft, that was his title, Kingdom Come. He wanted to do this story as based on the story of St. Paul. Was he the one on the road to Damascus?
Yeah, Saul, who changed his name to become Paul because of his conversion,
yes.
Was an active prosecutor of Christians because these people were betraying the true Jewish faith.
Right.
They were Jewish people turning away from God and saying that now there's some new God. And he actively persecuted and killed them, and then stood by and encouraged people to kill them, because there's a quote where he's holding people's clothes. And then, he has this experience where he gets struck and blind.
Right.
And I can't remember if it's on the road to Damascus or not, but he goes to some place and has to talk to someone. And at that point, it literally says the scales fall off of his eyes.
Ah, yes.
The guy who he has to go talk to is told that Saul is coming to talk to him, and he thinks that he's going to die because of that. But he decides to trust what God has set him up to do. And, then we get introduced to Paul, who is a member of the Roman state and is allowed to travel through borders with no problems, and is probably the first most well-known Christian evangelist.
Yeah. Does the knowledge that that's what Paul Schrader had in mind, does that make you see the script differently?
As a story of faith and obsession and, transformation to from being a debunker to a believer. Oh yeah.
Then he succeeded. But it's not the story that Spielberg wanted to tell. And the strange thing is, I think Close Encounters, as filmed, is much more successful in representing, well, I would call it blind faith, because that's what the UFO believers in the film have. They have a blind faith. They are driven, and they don't know why they're driven, but they know they are. And I think the film does it so much better than the script.
Yeah.
The other thing in my notes, there is a book about the making of Close Encounters. It's not very good on the actual making, but it is quite good on the sort of the origin and the development of the scripts. And apparently after this script, there was another script by John Hill. His script was also no good for Spielberg. One thing that Hill pointed out is that he thought there was a serious problem with Schrader's script from a science fictional point of view. And that is that it combined more than one science fictional idea, and Hill believed that it just confuses things. So in other words, if you're trying to tell a science fictional story, you want to change one thing from reality. So it might be UFOs are flying saucers. That's our science fictional twist. Everything else is just like the real world. Or mind control. You can have that. But he thought putting the two together, that was clumsy. So he wrote a script that was totally different. Again, no good, rejected, and eventually Spielberg decides, I'm going to have to write this myself. So that's what he did. He did apparently have some other writers come in and polish the script, but Spielberg remained the only credited writer on the film. Overall, did you like the script? And do you think the script would have made a good movie?
I don't know. I think it'd be a great 45-minute show of some kind, but I don't know if it'd make a full feature-length movie.
Sure. And I guess by now we've we've pretty much seen this film, haven't we? I mean, we haven't seen this particular story of this particular character, but we've seen so many films about searching for UFOs, communicating with aliens. So at this point in time, we're looking at this and it's doing a lot of things that seem very familiar. But back in 1974, maybe a lot of this was new in terms of film script. And if you think in terms of the science fiction films that had preceded this, there weren't many that were really very good.
Wasn't there a movie written about the abduction of Betty and Barney Hill, starring James Earl Jones, that came out in the 70s?
There was. That was a TV movie.
Okay. I think they were out there, but they had nowhere near the reach and impact that Close Encounters did.
And it came hot on the heels of Star Wars. I mean, people talk about Star Wars changing cinema forever, and it did. But I think it was really the 1-2 blow of Star Wars and Close Encounters in rapid succession that really is what changed movies.
This was the time of Spielberg and Lucas. Mm. It was the beginning of their careers, which extends all the way till today.
Yes.
And they're big careers.
Yeah. So that was our close encounter with Paul Schrader's script that was never filmed.
Although I have a quick follow-up question for you.
Okay.
How in the world did you find this?
I just Googled it.
Are you serious?
Seriously, yeah. I knew that there had been an earlier script because Spielberg talks about it in the interviews on the Blu-ray. And you've got to realise that I've spent the last 20 years of my life doing screenplay research. Mm-hmm. And the first rule of screenplay research is if you want a screenplay, Google the name of the film with PDF on the end of it. And there's probably a 50-50 chance that you'll find the screenplay.
Wow.
I just did Close Encounters screenplay, Paul Schrader, PDF. And bam, there it was.
And the internet delivers.
Yep. Anyway, we'll put a link to that PDF on our show notes so that you can find it through us. How about a little quiz?
Okay.
This was inspired by The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. Now, last week we reviewed the book that is spun off from that podcast. They have a kind of a quiz, and they call it Science or Fiction.
Oh.
And the way this works is I've got 3 statements here. 2 of them are from the real world of science. 1 of them is from science fiction. And your job is to detect which one of these is from science fiction. Does that make sense?
Yes, it's a Sesame Street quiz. One of these things is not like the others.
It is. That would have been a quicker way of saying it. So I'm going to give you these 3 statements. If you like, you can discuss the statement after I've said it, and then I'll move on to the next statement. And then after you've heard all 3, you can decide which one is from science fiction. So here's the first one. In 1903, at the University of Nancy in France, a scientist called Prosper René Blondelot detected changes in the brightness of an electric spark in an X-ray beam, and he later attributed this to a new form of radiation. Subsequently, 120 other scientists in 300 published articles saw the same radiation, which came from most substances. The only substances it didn't come from was green wood and some treated metals. So there you go. That's your first statement, which might be from the world of science or it might be from the world of science fiction.
I'm feeling pretty science fiction-y at this point, but I want to hold judgment till I hear the other ones.
Okay.
Did not come from green wood or certain treated metals.
Yeah.
Okay.
The next one, in 1962, at the University of California, San Diego, in La Jolla, physicists Gordon Bernstein and Albert Cooper discovered anomalous noise in a physics experiment relating to spontaneous resonance. They claimed to discover that the noise was coming in bursts timed to form Morse code.
Timed to form Morse code. Okay.
Okay, the third one. In 1977, at Ohio State University, astronomer Jerry R. Amon was working on a SETI project, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, when he discovered an anomaly in the recorded data from a radio telescope. The anomaly simply appeared as a 6-character code in the data, and the actual code was 6EQUJ5, and the anomaly lasted for 72 seconds.
Wow.
So 3 statements. 2 of those are from the world of science, and 1 is from the world of science fiction.
So the third statement from the 70s reminds me of the wow signal, which is a well-known thing in science fiction and UFO studies, because people point to it and say, oh, this must be, an intelligent signal of some kind. But it only happened once. It was never recreated. They couldn't localize it. But it was an actual thing. So I'm going to say that was science.
Okay.
And the other 2, the green wood and certain treated metals, I cannot think of a single... Now, that doesn't mean there isn't one, but I cannot think of a single scientific thing that would cause variation in the X-ray emissions or transmissions or viewing of any of those. The one where they think it's Morse code reminds me of neutron stars or quasars, except those tend to be very regular and not intermittent. They're more like beacons.
Yeah.
But that seems to me more likely than the green wood and certain treated metals. So I'm going with the green wood and certain treated metals as science fiction, and the other 2 are science.
Okay. I'll go through these in the way that they do on the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. I won't go through them in order. I'll do it in the most dramatically strategic way of going through them. I'll start with the third one. In 1977, the SETI astronomer who picked up this anomalous data, which lasted for 72 seconds. You are absolutely right. That was the WOW event. That's exactly what that was. So that is from the world of science. Now, the next one I'm going to go to is the one with the Morse code from 1962. That one is from science fiction. That is from the novel Timescape by Gregory Benford. And Timescape, I don't know if you've ever read it.
No.
It's set in 2 time periods. I think one is 1962 and one is probably the 1990s. I can't remember now, but sort of like 30-odd years later. And there's something bad happening, and they want to warn people back in an earlier time. So they use tachyons to send a message back through time, and the message is received in 1962. So that one is science fiction. But then that leaves the peculiarity of the first one, with this radiation which comes from everything except green wood and treated metals. Now, that is from the world of science, but I can understand you being suspicious of it. And the reason that you are suspicious of it is that it's from the world of science, but it is not science. It is a famous case of scientists being misled by their own observations. This is the case of N-rays. Have you ever heard of N-rays?
No.
So this is shortly after X-rays and other forms of radiation had been discovered, and this French scientist was just experimenting with sparks and X-ray beams and all sorts of combinations of things. And he had this particular combination that produced what he was convinced was some kind of effect. And he reported it to the scientific community. Hundreds of people tried it out and got the same effect, they believed. But there was one skeptical scientist who went into this guy's lab and messed with the apparatus. So, for example, if there was a piece of metal in the beam, and our French scientist was saying, yes, there are N-rays coming from this metal, I can see it here. What our sceptical guy did was he took the piece of metal away while nobody was looking. And then the French scientist would say, yes, the N-rays are still coming off that piece of metal that's in the beam. And he knew that, no, it can't be, because the metal's not there anymore. So it's a famous case of a skeptic being suspicious of scientific results and intervening in order to disprove So it's a kind of debunking, but it's not cover-up debunking like we saw in the Paul Schrader script. This is genuine scientific debunking of a false observation.
Huh.
So that first one is from the world of science, but it's not science.
Amazing.
So I apologise for misleading you a little there.
Oh, you're supposed to. That's part of the quiz fun.
So I don't know how we give a score for a quiz of that nature, but you did very well.
Thanks. I know my hard science really well. It's just my fake science I need to be more read up on, apparently.
Yeah. Shall we do a quick past, present, future?
Yes.
Just a quick one which I am putting in the past because by the time people hear this podcast, I hope it will be in the past, and that is in real life. Artemis 1 was postponed in its first attempted launch. I'm hoping by the time this podcast goes out that it will have successfully launched on its way to the moon. But of course, as of the time of recording, which is the Friday before the second attempt, we don't really know.
I'm kind of glad they did the abort because they weren't sure that everything was going to go right. And it's the practice of learning from your mistakes and not repeating them, even if it was just a faulty sensor.
With Apollo, they gradually worked up to adding people and then adding more parts to the spaceship, adding to the complexity, and then eventually having the courage to send people to the moon. But the intention with this one is Artemis 1 goes to the moon and back empty, but Artemis 2 does the same thing with people. And then Artemis 3 will take them there and land them.
Yeah. I mean, if we're going to do it in 3 instead of 11, that's quite the change.
Yes.
I have 2 past items. One is a quick one.
Mm-hmm.
My library has a streaming service called Canopy.
Okay.
And I found that they have the Space 1999 series, both seasons of it on there. And I watched the first 2 or 3 episodes.
Have you seen them before?
I seem to remember seeing them on like a Sunday afternoon in the 70s. Science fiction from the 70s is kind of its own thing. And this is British science fiction.
Yes, but with 2 top American stars. No, 3.
So there's Martin Landau and Barbara Bain. And who's the third one?
Barry Morse as the professor.
Oh, okay.
But he's British in the series. But I think, is he American or is he Canadian? Anyway, he was a star from The Fugitive.
Oh, wow.
I quite like Space 1999 Season 1, but they changed it in Season 2 and it wasn't as good.
If I continue watching it, I'll be careful.
Yeah, you'll know when they get to Season 2 because it completely changes.
I always wonder why they make those huge changes.
Well, in this case, it was to try and hold the audience, and it was also because they brought in Fred Freiberger, the guy who was famous for killing Star Trek. They brought him in to kill Space 1999.
Oh, wow. My other part from the past is I read Mars by Ben Bova, which is published in 1992. And that's part of his very famous Grand Tour series, which started in 1985. And it's all about the colonization of the solar system.
And does it hold up?
I would say that science fiction is successful for me when my scientific knowledge and my reasoning gets suspended. It's a suspension of disbelief, right?
Yeah.
And so, by the time they arrived on Mars and found traces of moisture in the atmosphere, I was sold. I thought this was a plausible thing. The characters are very real. I think it's a great description of the interpersonal conflicts that they work so hard to eliminate in Astronaut Choice and the effects of politics and government on science. It was good.
Very good. Moving on to present things, at the time of recording, a writer that we've mentioned before on the podcast, although we've never actually discussed his work, but that's Ogunecheway Donald Ekpeki, the Nigerian writer who is nominated for a Hugo Award, and he's also guest of honour at the World Science Fiction Convention. And the last couple of weeks has been a bit dramatic because he was denied a visa for entering the US, and this was quite a shock when your guest of honour for your prestigious convention isn't going to be able to turn up. He was able to make a second application, and apparently there was some support given by 2 US senators, and the second application was successful, so he was permitted to enter the US.
Do you remember the reason why he was initially turned down?
Well, I think the suggestion was that there was no evidence that there was anything that would cause him to return to his home country.
Yeah.
So they were afraid that he would go to the US and just stay there.
I mean, the US is a nice place.
Well, yeah, but I mean, he's got a home and a family and a house, belongings.
I was shocked to hear that.
Yeah.
Dismayed.
Me too. But then, do you know what happened next, Colin?
He tried to get on an airplane and was slightly late and didn't know that he was supposed to bribe the gate person in order to let him through.
Yes.
and it had his luggage on it.
Yes. By now he may have arrived at the Worldcon, but I sincerely hope there's a crowd of people cheering him when he when he turns up.
Talk about struggles.
I've got two other things that I'm putting under the present heading. One is a bit of a stretch for this podcast, really, but there is a book coming out. Well, it's out now, so this is why it's under the present. But it's not really science fiction, but it's by a writer who is associated with science fiction, and that's Nigel Neal, who wrote the Quatermass series. And early on in his career, he wrote a book of short stories called Tomato Cane, which was never reprinted. It was published, I think, in the 1940s. He died a number of years ago, and somehow people have persuaded the estate to republish the book, so it's out. And I've got a physical copy of it. So it's called Tomato Cane and Other Stories. And they're mostly sort of supernatural fantasy things rather than science fiction. And my only other present thing is to say I am finally watching Star Trek Strange New Worlds.
Oh!
And I've seen 2 episodes so far, and I'm quite pleased with it.
From a Star Trek fan of your caliber, that's a lot.
And there's still time for it to go horribly wrong. But
I have a couple of present items.
Okay.
The historical database of science fiction is kind of like it's a dictionary, really, that says, what this science fiction term means. And then there's a whole series of quotes from various books that shows you where it was first used and how the usage of it has changed over time.
Yes.
The author of that is doing a series of articles on boingboing.net, talking about what they're working on every month or so, the terms and what's going on.
Great.
So the first article was published on August 23rd, and it was about being telepathized and also about mind control as a verb instead of a noun. So I will send you a link for that so you can drop it in the show notes in case people want to follow along and see what's new on the database.
Fantastic. Yes, thank you.
And the other one, the School Library Journal, has an article talking about potential replacements or upgrades for the classic American school literary canon.
Right.
So instead of reading The Lord of the Flies, they picked a number of books, including The Hunger Games and Divergent. And instead of 1984, you could read Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi Adeyemi. There are also replacements for Little House on the Prairie, Pride and Prejudice, Mice and Men, Great Expectations. But I ran out of free articles at that point and couldn't see what other science fiction or fantasy books they are suggesting to talk about these, classic human things about struggle and class and prejudice and displacement.
I remember there was a little bit of a fuss a couple of years ago when I think it was Fahrenheit 451 was taken off some reading lists and replaced with some more modern works. People get very upset when changes happen, but I always think, well, this reading list isn't for you. This is for the next generation of readers. Let's give them what's good for them, not necessarily what was good for us,
Yeah. Better things can come.
Indeed. As for future things, I've got a couple of things here. One, again, isn't really science fiction, but it's science fiction adjacent. And that is that finally, in December of this year, Ray Bradbury's first book, Dark Carnival, is going to be published as a paperback and an e-book. And that's never happened before. His first book was published in 1947, Dark Carnival, and he later rewrote the stories and turned it into The October Country. But the original book was only ever reprinted once in a limited edition. But now his main publisher, HarperCollins, are finally releasing Dark Carnival, as a paperback and an ebook, and a hardcover as well, I think. So this is it at the end of the year, in December.
Will you be giving yourself a Christmas present this year?
You try and stop me. I'll have the ebook, definitely. And then my other future thing is a new series that's coming from Netflix at the end of October, and it is Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities, which by all accounts is an anthology series, mostly sort of horror fantasy, I think, but it sounds promising. Of course, we've had lots of anthology series over the years, some of which have been very disappointing, and some of which have been wonderful. Because this has got a famous name attached, I'm hoping it's going to be good.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully he vets some really good works.
Hopefully. Do you have any future items?
I have been very nose down the last several weeks and kind of paying attention to what's happening right now versus what's coming up. So I will have to look ahead for our next episode.
Well, I think that's it.
Yeah, I'm out of notes again.
Yeah, I've come to the end of my notes as well. Thanks for listening, and we hope you'll join us next time. We're Phil Nichols and Colin Cuskey. Our theme tune is from purpleplanet.com. Look for the show notes on our website 101sf.blogspot.com, where you can also buy us a coffee through the tip jar. And you can also find us as Science Fiction 101 on Facebook. And finally, please follow us or subscribe to us on your podcast app. You'll find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. And we always appreciate a 5-star review, which helps our visibility on the various platforms, so go to it. Thanks for listening. See you next time.